Well, Sarah, we're so excited that you're here. Kay and I are big fans of you and your work, and we just so appreciate just how your wealth of information and just incredibly helpful when it comes to whether someone should or shouldn't take birth control, which is a topic we talk a lot about. But I want to talk about a question we get often at our company, which is what do you think are maybe some of the biggest concerns when it comes to long-term use of hormonal birth control?
I think that the thing that I hear the most frequently is, well, there's two. So one is, does it affect my like who I am permanently? Right. And so if you're on it for a really long time, then does that cause permanent structural change in your psychology or within your body? And the answer to that seems to be no, which is great news. Unless you start, here's the question mark. So if you start taking it when you're like 19 and older, so once you're an adult and your brain is mostly done developing, then it seems like things go back to normal. Once you're off of it, sort of back to normal. But for people who take it as teenagers, we don't yet know the answer to that because when you're in the pubertal transition, the sort of lead, the hormone that's like kind of coordinating a lot of those post-pubertal brain changes are your sex hormones. And so when you have your sex hormones flatlined with hormonal birth control, then that probably, I mean, the potential is definitely there that it's going to impact post-pubertal brain development. And we just don't know because there's not a lot of research on adolescent birth control use and like what that does in terms of like development and structural change. We don't know a whole lot just yet about what that might do. And so I always, sort of that with the adolescence aside, just knowing that you will go back to normal, I think can be really comforting to a lot of women.
Your book is called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. And I don't think people automatically assume or recognize that hormonal birth control can have an impact on their brain. They might like see it as completely separate things. So, what's actually happening in the brain when somebody's on hormonal birth control?
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating question. And it's really interesting because that is a blind spot that we all have, right? It's like we take the pill to prevent ovulation because we don't want to get pregnant. And we never think about the fact that when we ovulate, that's what creates our hormones. And our brain runs on lots of things, but one of those things that impacts what our brain does is our hormones. And the way that the pill works, actually, the first line of action is the brain. And so when you take a synthetic birth control, or not birth control synthetic, but whenever you take when you take these synthetic hormones, you're getting a relatively low dose of estradiol. And then you're getting this relatively high dose of this synthetic progesterone or progestin. And that progestin actually gets picked up by your hypothalamus in your brain. And then that is what like tells the ovaries not to start stimulating egg follicles. And so even the prevention of ovulation starts in the brain. And so essentially when we're asking the question, like, what does hormonal birth control do to the brain? The question is, what happens when we shut down ovulation? And so to answer that, and the way I start out the book is the first couple of chapters are just laying the groundwork of what women are like when they're not on hormonal birth control. So essentially, like, what is it that our sex hormones do in the brain? And our sex hormones are a really important part of what our brain uses to create the experience of being the person we are. And even though we tend to only think about our hormones in terms of like, oh no, do I have a skin breakout? Or, oh no, my, this period related symptom or that period related symptom, they are like a key part of things like our motivational state, our sexual desire, things like attraction. They play a role in how we regulate our stress response. They play a role in how we regulate our immune function. I mean, they affect our body from head to toe. And just to give some of the areas that we cover in the book is we talk about some of the ways that hormonal birth control is known to be linked with changes in like the types of people that people are attracted to and their levels of sexual desire and the way that they regulate stress and also their mental health and their emotional states and motivational states. and our response to pleasurable things. I mean, it affects everything. And so the book is essentially, it's lifting that veil, because I think that a lot of times when we're taking a medication, because we're taking it for the effect it has on the ovaries, that's all that we're really thinking about with it. And we have this blind spot to such a degree. And this is embarrassing to admit. I admit it in my book, so I'll just admit it here too. And that is, here I was, because I was in a Ph.D. program in psychology. And so I'd spent much of my early career studying women's sexual psychology and studying motivation and also studying hormones. And so I'd published papers on the impact of women's changing sex hormones over the cycle and the way that that influences women's motivational state. So I'm publishing this paper, I'm aware of this research, and all that at the same time, I'm taking hormonal birth control and never thinking twice about the idea that that might affect my motivational states and who I'm attracted to and all these other things that I've been publishing on about regular hormones. It just like never even dawned on me that, oh, well, if I don't have these processes going on, then who am I? Like what am I like, what do I become? And that is really, part of the question that we answer in the book is like, who does a woman become when she's on this drug that nobody's really spent any time asking that question until very recently?
Man, it's crazy because I was also on birth control for so long, like in my adolescent years. So I'm so fascinated with what might have impacted my brain now as an adult, because I was on it for quite a long time. But it's so interesting because you mentioned like you just get used to taking it. You don't even think, like, you're doing all these papers and research and you're like, oh gosh, I'm taking birth control, but we just get so used to it. So I'd love to hear more about your story. Like, what was the aha moment for you when you realized like, oh, this is actually impacting me? Let me kind of look into this and go deeper.
So there was three things, but the two biggies are the first one was I went off of it. So I was on hormonal birth control for almost 12 years. And I was on it pretty consistently, except for when I went off of it to have my kids. And I got pregnant really quickly with both my kids. So I didn't have a big gap of time that I wasn't on it. It was like I was on it, and then all of a sudden I was pregnant, and then I was lactating, and then I was back on it, and then I was pregnant, and then I was lactating. And it was after that, that it was about, I don't know, like, I think my son was 2, and I told my partner, I'm like, okay, you need to get a vasectomy because I'm done with hormonal birth control. Even though I never thought I had any problems with it. I tolerated it fine. And then he went off of it. And then about 3 months later, I was like, oh, hello. And I was noticing that I was like going to the gym more frequently again. And I was downloading new music for the first time in a decade. Like, I was just like really into music and like downloading new songs, and I downloaded Pandora and I was listening to different stations, and I was really into my libido, like, came back, because I had thought that I had just kind of outgrown sex. I just thought, oh, that was, when I was in my early 20s, like, but I just thought that I just wasn't really into it. And then everything just came back, and I just felt so alive in a way that I hadn't felt alive. And I was like, wait, did my birth control have something to do with the fact that I was feeling so one-dimensional? And then I was like, maybe a little bit, but whatever, you can revisit that another day. And I didn't think anything too much of it. But then about 6 months after that, I was at a research talk by a friend of mine who studies stress. And he was talking about the results of a study that he had done, and that they had collected data on something like 750 people, and that they'd only analyzed the data from the men in their sample, because it turns out that almost all of the women in their study were on hormonal birth control. And everybody knows that women on hormonal birth control don't have a cortisol response to stress, or a stress hormone response to stress. And I was like, wait, what? Like, everybody knows that women on hormonal birth control don't have a cortisol response to stress. Like, that's really serious, because that's the kind of pattern that you see in people who have like PTSD, right? That's like a trauma type of a stress response. So I waited until the talk was over, because that was all I could think about. And I went and I approached him and I said, is that really true? Is it true that women who are on the pill don't have a stress hormone response to stress? And he said, Yeah, I was really surprised by it too. But then I went to the research literature, and lo and behold, they've been publishing on this since the 90s. And I was like, what? And so, because here I was, I'm a psychologist and I study women, and I was on the pill, and I was like, this is insane. So I went back to my research lab and I dug around in the literature, and sure enough, there's a bunch of papers that have been published to this very effect. And anyway, this was when I had sort of that aha moment where I was like, of course the pill causes differences in the stress response. Of course, I felt different when I went off the pill. Like, the pill changes your hormones, and your brain uses your hormones to create the experience of being the person you are. So of course the pill changed me. Like, being on the pill changes everything. And that was what led me then to begin doing research over the next several years into the different ways that hormonal birth control affects the brain and our psychological responses and our behavior. And it was really in part like my own experiences. And then, learning that the pill affects something as far removed from sex as the stress response. And in this way, that's really not healthy. Like, this is a kind of thing that we tend to see in trauma victims, because it's usually indicative of somebody who has been so overwhelmed with stress that their body just shuts down the stress response. It'll just say, all right, nope, no more stress hormones, because stress hormones can be really damaging to the body if we experience them for long periods of time. And so what the body does in cases of trauma is it'll just shut down the stress response. And that's what we also see in women who are on hormonal birth control. And this is, again, it's not something that women know about. And so when I went back and I saw the research that had been done, and everything ranging from mood, and then the stress response, and then things like attraction and sexual desire. And I was like, nobody knows, women don't know any of this. That was what motivated me to write the book, because I knew that information needed to be out there. So that way women could be given a language to describe what they're experiencing. Because so many, I don't know about you all, but most women I know have some stories about what happened when they were on hormonal birth control. And a lot of times, up until the time that this book was written, it was very hard to find validation from that, because people, a lot of times women's doctors would make them feel like they were imagining things, and there wasn't any research that women knew anything about that was validating their experiences. And so I wanted to provide this as sort of a framework for women to understand that these are the range of things that can potentially happen when you're using hormonal birth control, and then be able to have conversations about it with their healthcare providers, with other women, with their partners, and then be able to make the most informed decisions about their health that they can.
Wow. I will admit, I'm not a birth control expert. I had no idea about the stress response.
Same.
Also, too, I grew up in a traditional Indian household where you don't talk about birth control. That's just not even not even a topic of conversation. But what's the mechanism there? Is it the progestin? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And what the current wisdom is that some of the progestins, because they don't have really good binding specificity for progesterone receptors, that they also will bind to other types of receptors in the brain and elsewhere in the body. And in that one of those types of receptors that it binds to are glucocorticoid receptors, which pick up cortisol. And so essentially what it might be doing is creating within the body this hyperactivated stress response, where cortisol receptors are being stimulated in this huge amounts because of the amount of progestin in these pills. And that leading the body to think that there's something terrible that's happening, and then shutting down the stress response. And the body does this by releasing a ton of what's known as, this is a terrible word. I'm not even say it, but it's basically cortisol binding globulin, but there's this glucocorticoid binding globulin. And so it's this binding globulin. Essentially what it does, it binds to cortisol and makes it inactive. And that's what causes the blunting of the stress response.
And I'm so curious. So remind me, so when we shut down the stress response, what are the feelings that someone might get? So you said it's frequent in PTSD patients. So do they have feelings of overwhelm or more heightened anxiety? What is a repercussion of that?
Yeah, no, right. And that's a really great question too, because sometimes when people hear that, they think, well, that sounds great. You can please shut down my stress response. And yes, and so when we're experiencing stress, just like really quickly to give people a little bit of sort of orient them to what happens when you're stressed out. There's two things that happen. The one thing is that your sympathetic stress response goes off, and that's the stress that most of us feel. So like if your heart starts to race and your breath gets fast or your voice catches, and that's your sympathetic response. And women who are on the pill have that totally intact. And so they still experience the same feeling of stress. But what happens, what cortisol does, is it actually helps the body cope with stress and be able to resolve the stress and allow you to learn from stress. So some of the things that it does, for example, is it leads to the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus. And so it gets the brain primed for learning. So that way, whatever it is that's happening that's meaningful, our brain will absorb and then take in that experience. It also helps it dumps like fat and sugar into our bloodstream that allows us to be able to manage the stressor, both physically, like if we need to get away, like run away from a lion or a tiger, but then also giving our brain the blood and the glucose and fats that it needs in order to do all of this stuff like birthing new neurons. And so it helps to return. It helps us to return to homeostasis. It essentially helps bring us back to normal, and cope from and learn from the stress. And so what happens if you don't have that going on, and like what we see in the context of PTSD is, yes, feelings of overwhelm and not being able to cope. And so what this tends to do is it tends to lead to depression and anxiety. And lo and behold, there's this literature that finds that being on hormonal birth control is linked with both of those factors, both both anxiety and depression. And this could be one of the mechanisms.
Cortisol is also so important for our immunity. So is there any connection between like low immunity or getting sick more often in birth control?
I love these questions. I feel like I could have just been spoon feeding all these questions because we actually just did a study. Yeah, because that's such a smart question because so cortisol, one of the things that it does is it regulates the immune system. It turns the volume up and down on inflammatory activity in the body. And so one question that you get is if you turn down the volume on cortisol, which turns down the volume on inflammation, does that then lead to runaway inflammation? And there is some research linking, for example, hormonal birth control pill use with heightened levels of CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is something that is an indirect measure of the levels of inflammation in the body. And so what we wanted to do, and what we did, is we recently conducted a study that just came out. I literally just got the preprint like yesterday, and looking at the inflammatory response to stress in women who are using hormonal birth control compared to natural cyclers. And nobody had looked at that yet, which to me was really surprising. And so what we did is we brought women into the lab and we stressed them out. And we do this by making them give a speech, like an impromptu speech in front of a video camera. And then we make them do math, like really complicated math problems. Yeah, it's like really awful. They hate it. And like all the people like look at them while they're like giving their talk. And if they have time left, because we tell them they have to do it for 5 minutes, then the researchers will say, you need to continue for 5 minutes. And they'll say, I have nothing else to say. They'll say, then just repeat what you said. And then we make them count backwards in steps of 13 from like 1,145 or something. And if they mess up, they have to start over. And so it's horrible. And so it really stresses everybody out. And what we looked at is we looked at women's cortisol and then their inflammation levels in response to the stressor. And what we found with the women on hormonal birth control that was so fascinating is that they had a different inflammatory profile in response to stress relative to the naturally cycling women. And in particular, what we found was that the women who were on the pill, so rather than having, because what we found in our natural cyclers is that their response to stress was very much mediated through this. It's a pro-inflammatory cytokine, but it's IL-6, it's interleukin 6, and it's an inflammatory. So just think of it as an inflammatory factor, but it's one that is both inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. It's got these. We release a lot of this type of inflammation after we exercise, for example, because our body is broken down muscle, and then it's helping to rebuild that, and so it's got this sort of, it's got these dual properties. And what we see with women on the pill is their inflammatory response is more heavily dominated toward what's known as tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha. They have more of a strong TNF alpha response to stress. And this is actually the type of inflammatory activity that is oftentimes linked with autoimmunity. So this is the type of inflammatory factor that's really is most strongly implicated in autoimmunity. And in fact, many of the medications that exist on the market that are to help minimize the effects of autoimmunity are TNF alpha blockers, because it's so implicated in those in the etiology of that disease. And so we think this is really interesting because, of course, women who are on the pill, we now know, are at a heightened risk for the development of many autoimmune diseases. And we think that this could potentially be one of the links that's playing a role in that. And so that's one of the things that we're going to begin to look into.
I'm mind blown right now. I
Yeah.
think I should be part of your study because looking back, I'm off birth control over the past few years, and it's been an incredible journey now. But looking back, I was in a very stressful job. So stress levels were high. Clearly wasn't operating in the right way because I was on birth control. But I did have 2 autoimmune flare-ups like in those times. And now, obviously I still deal with stress, but I have not had that autoimmune flare-up since post birth control, excuse me. So that is like mind blowing because I'm like, where did this come from? Like, I'm relatively healthy. I mean, I definitely was stressed at the time work wise, but that's fascinating. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and there's probably 2 things going on there. So one is the progestins, in the pill potentially when they monkey with the cortisol response, are going to be monkeying with inflammatory activity. But another thing, and this is something that I'm really interested in, and I've begun kind of digging into it, is the absence of progesterone. Because when you're on hormonal birth control, those progestins, like, that is not progesterone. And most of them are synthesized from testosterone, and they don't get metabolized by the body in the same way. They don't have the same types of metabolites. They don't have the same kinds of properties as real deal progesterone. And one of progesterone's like big properties in the body is that it's incredibly anti-inflammatory. It shifts the body from a really like a pro-inflammatory state into an anti-inflammatory state. And it does this so that way our bodies can get pregnant. Because if we didn't, if we have this, foreign DNA that's trying to invade our uterus, like, our body would say, "Oh, that's a pathogen," and then it would try to kill the embryo. And so we shift into this anti-inflammatory state to allow for the possibility of pregnancy. But like, what this also creates is, for naturally cycling women, is we're constant, we wax and wane between this pro-inflammatory state and this anti-inflammatory state. And it acts as this really nice check within the body, to sort of keep inflammatory activity at bay and to keep it tamped down. And so one of the things that might be going on there is women who are on hormonal birth control aren't getting that same break on their immune system. They're just like constantly in the more pro-inflammatory state without having that exposure to actual progesterone, which is so immunomodulatory. And this also could be a contributing factor, which I think is really interesting.
It's so interesting to me. I watched another interview where you were discussing the difference between progestin and then, for example, postmenopausal women or menopausal women or perimenopausal women who use bioidentical progesterone or something like that. And it hit me. I never thought about it. Why can't we use what they're using, right? Because it doesn't have the same side effects. Can you talk about, like, what are the barriers there?
So I've wondered the same question, okay, because it seemed crazy to me. So here's what do you guys know who, surely you know Laura Briden, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so she wrote the Period Repair Manual, and she's just awesome. And because I'm not a physician, I'm a research psychologist, and so and I understand progesterone to the extent that I understand hormones and what their properties are, but I'm not into pharmacodynamics. That's like not my area of expertise. And so I asked her, I said, why don't they make birth control out of progesterone? Like, because that just seems nuts to me. And she said that her thought was that it was because the levels of progesterone, like actual progesterone, that you would need to take to shut down the brain ovary axis enough to suppress ovulation would be like so high that it would have caused too much fatigue or something like that. I don't know. But and that seems like a reasonable, and she's really smart. And so I think that sounds kind of reasonable, but then I'm like, are we sure? Like, are we sure? Like, and so I've thought, because this is the kind of researcher I am, I've thought I could, and I also have access to progesterone. I have thought about seeing what I can do and then measuring my ovulation, like taking like 3 progesterone in the like every day and just like seeing if I shut down my HPG.
That would be really interesting, because is it basically that like hormonal birth control tricks your body into thinking it's pregnant, essentially, right?
Well, essentially, it tricks the body into thinking that you're in the luteal phase of the
Okay.
cycle. Because
Okay.
anytime that your body's releasing progesterone, that means that that you have an empty egg follicle that's hanging out there. And that means that you should not stimulate new egg follicles, because there's a chance that this egg that you just released might implant and you might be pregnant. And so it's actually kind of tricking your brain into thinking that you're in the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase. Because and then what happens is this little endocrine structure that releases, because how it all happens is, you are stimulating, your egg follicles get stimulated. Like when you first start your period, your egg follicles get stimulated by your brain, and then that causes an egg to mature. And as it starts to mature, it releases estrogen, and so then we're getting all bathed with estrogen and everything's estrogen is great. And then we ovulate, and then we have this empty egg follicle, and ovulation usually happens around day 14. Then we have this empty egg follicle that will only, and it turns into an empty or temporary endocrine structure called the corpus luteum, and it'll only stay intact for 14 days unless a pregnancy takes hold. And so what happens is it starts releasing progesterone, and the progesterone will get released for about 14 days. And if an embryo doesn't implant, it disintegrates and goes away. And then progesterone is no longer being released. And then that big hormone crash tells our brain to start stimulating our ovaries. And so that's a cycle. And so when we're taking the pill, it's like if we take some level of progesterone, like a relatively high level of progesterone, it should be telling our brain not to stimulate our ovaries, which is why I'm like, I bet if I took 3,
Keep us posted.
That would be such a cool experiment.
I know. I mean, seriously, no, I really want to do it. And I'm thinking about just starting on myself, because we do this sorts of thing in the lab all the time. Like we'll have like a crazy idea and we'll draw our own blood and like go in the lab and monkey around with it and see what we can learn. And this is one that I've been considering doing. I'm like, oh, it might make me batshit crazy for a month, but in the name of science,
You will do it for science.
Yeah. So I might do that. I'll let you guys know if I do, because I've been toying with the idea, because it just seems so nuts to me. Because I've asked this question so many times, and I don't know. And it's not that I don't believe the answers I've been given. I just wonder whether they're wrong.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, imagine if it worked, it would be groundbreaking, because there would be an option for people that didn't have maybe potentially like hundreds of horrible side effects.
Right. And it would be so much better. And the cool thing about progesterone is that because I'm writing a new book right now, and it has a lot to do with progesterone. And so I'm reading a lot about it. And one of the cool things about it is that we seem to build up tolerance for it, but like in a good way. So, because when you take it, if you take it like orally, or if you're taking any sort of progesterone supplement, you get really tired. It makes you really sleepy. But after after you take it for a little while, you become tolerant to that and you no longer feel that way. But according to my readings anyway, the HPG axis, right? So the brain ovary axis does not develop tolerance. And that would suggest that you could take that really high dose and you would adjust to it psychologically, where you wouldn't be feeling tired, but it would still shut down your ovaries, which is what we would want it to do. And so that's why, that's what brought me back to the question of like, all right, I need to do this. I need to do this study on myself and see if this works. And I have a friend who works for a naturopath. And she said that when she was like getting ready for her honeymoon, that she was using progesterone cream because she was supposed to get her period. And she was using progesterone every day to postpone it. And so I'm like, it has to work.
Yeah. There's definitely something here. I feel like we're all going to come back in 5 years and be like, remember when? And now look at this.
Yeah, no, totally, totally. Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting, right?
So interesting. I mean, I want to talk about this huge subject of birth control changing your preference for a partner because I know this is a very hot topic. Yasmin and I have seen videos of women saying, "Oh, I got off birth control and I broke up with my partner because something happened." How does this how does this happen?
So yeah, no, so this research is so provocative. And this research is actually one of the things that also led me to get really excited about the topic of the birth control pill, because I was like, this makes perfect sense. And it's, holy moly, if this is true. So there's been research for several decades showing that when estrogen changes across the cycle, that it's linked with an increased preference for things like facial masculinity, vocal masculinity, behavioral masculinity. Essentially, it just like increases women's attraction to sort of manly men, masculinity, essentially, and even just maleness. Like women are just like more drawn to men generally, like in and at high fertility in the cycle. So when estrogen is high relative to when it is low. And so that research had been going on for a very long time. And it was only more recently that researchers thought to ask, well, what happens on the birth control pill? Because when you're on the birth control pill, your estrogen levels are kept flatlined and very low. And then the dominant hormone is the synthetic progesterone or progestin. And so women are never in this state of like having this increasing preference for testosterone markers and masculinity. And so researchers asked, like, is it possible that when we're on the pill that we prefer less masculine male faces and voices and that sort of thing? And what the research found is that lo and behold, women who are on hormonal birth control actually do prefer a somewhat less masculinized male face relative to what is preferred among naturally cycling women. And others have also found that women who are on hormonal birth control don't seem to be sensitive to cues of genetic compatibility that are communicated via scent. And so women who are on the pill tend to not really notice scent-based differences in things that these cues that are related to genetic compatibility, specifically immune system related compatibility. And also testosterone metabolites. So women who are naturally cycling are able to pick up on the scent of testosterone more readily than women who are on the pill. And so what what other researchers then thought to ask was, so what happens if a woman is on the pill and then goes off the pill? Sort of as you were talking about. And, given that the pill seems to be impacting our preferences in these ways, then could it be that when you go off of it, that it sort of nudges you out of attraction to your partner? And so some other researchers have found evidence suggesting that that might be the case. And in particular, there was one really nicely done longitudinal study where the researchers found that if women chose their partner when they were on hormonal birth control and then went off of it, their attraction to their partner did change. But what was really interesting about it is that they found that for some women, they became more attracted to their partner and they were more, like sexually desirous of them. And then they reported more relationship satisfaction after they went off of it. And then for some women, it was the opposite. And that it made them less attracted to their partner, lowered their relationship satisfaction, and made them less likely to want to have sex with their partner. And the thing that impacted whether women went this way and became like more attracted or went that way and became less attractive was how attractive the partner was. And essentially what it kind of comes down to is that women who are on hormonal birth control seem less sensitive to cues of things like partner compatibility, like with, genetic compatibility, less sensitive to cues related to sexiness. So some of those testosterone markers. And then when women go off of it, it's like the blinders come off. Right. And all of a sudden, like they are confronted with this array of cues that they weren't even able to pick up on before. So they're able to pick up on scent-based cues to similar, genetic compatibility, and scent-based cues to testosterone, and, visual cues to testosterone, and all of these types of things. And for some women, it'll be like, oh yeah, like this is great. Like they chose a partner who just happened to have these qualities that their non-pill version of themselves would like most desire. And then in some cases, it can lead women to say, ooh, ew, like this isn't working for me. And so, this is something that women, I think it's important that women understand can happen. It doesn't happen all the time. And, and I think that for most women, because the way that hormonal nudges work is they tend to give us little nudges this way and that way, is that for most women, it's not going to cause a big problem. But for some women, it does. And for some women, it causes a big positive problem, right? Because they just want to have sex with their partner all the time. Because now that they're off the pill, they're just so attracted to them. But it can definitely nudge you one way or the other in terms of your preferences.
I'm so curious, does a birth control impact your relationships like in a non-romantic way? So let's say like a work environment or a boss or a friend, like how does that work in that kind of setting?
That's a really interesting question, and it's not one that I've seen a lot of research on. So what I have seen, they've had research. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember even what they found. But one thing that we can predict, for example, is we know that when women are naturally cycling, that there can be greater things like greater intersexual competition and that sort of thing right near ovulation, and so women can get more competitive with one another in particular. And so one might expect that their relationships with other women become a little bit more dynamic, shall we say, when they're naturally cycling relative to what it is when they're on hormonal birth control. But I haven't seen any studies that have addressed that issue specifically. There's also some work looking at oxytocin signaling in the brain. And oxytocin is like a bonding hormone. And they've done some studies, and this was with romantic partners, but it could also potentially translate into our relationships with other close others, including children, because oxytocin is a big bonding hormone that gets released when we have a baby. And what the research seems to show is that women who are on hormonal birth control, that it seems to mess with their oxytocin signaling in response to the face of the one that they love. So normally when we see the face of somebody that we love, our brain will like our pleasure centers will come flushed with oxytocin, and it's just like makes us feel love and adoration for the person. And what the research has found is that for women who are on hormonal birth control, you don't get that effect. And this is something that could potentially impact, mother-child bonding, which I think is really important to know, because a lot of times when, after a woman has a baby, the doctor's very quick to want to get her on birth control just to make sure she doesn't get pregnant again. But this is something that could potentially end up interfering with the early day bonding between mother and child. And this is something that I think deserves a lot more research. There's only been one study on this particular topic, and I think that it's one that's really important, particularly given the extent to which birth control is pushed on women postpartum.
Yeah, I remember going to your 6 week postpartum follow up, and all my friends too, they told me when you go there, they're going to tell you got to get on birth control. Like it's one of the biggest topics. Not as much like, how are you doing? Well, tell me about things. It's like, you got to get on birth control. And, luckily I'm very informed in this case, but a lot of my friends, they got scared to the point where they started to take it because they were fearing another pregnancy. Something else that I learned from you is that there's over-the-counter options now. So what's up with that? And why is that available? And what are the challenges?
This is one of these things that I feel very ambivalent about. And so there is now an over-the-counter available birth control, and it is a progestin-only hormonal birth control product. And so when you take it every day, you get this daily dose of progestin, but it doesn't have any estrogen in it. And this type of hormonal birth control is by far the one that has the worst side effect profile in terms of mental health, and also weight gain, by the way. But the mental health thing is a lot more serious. Although some women might argue otherwise, but the mental health thing obviously can have much more catastrophic influences. So this is available over the counter, and this is the one that they made available because estrogen is thrombotic, meaning that it can cause cardiovascular events in the body. And because of that, they don't want that over the counter because of the potential, that if women who have heart-related or cardiovascular risks are taking it, it can be very dangerous for them. But the unfortunate thing is that it's the estrogen in hormonal birth control that makes women feel most normal. Like the reason that it's in most forms of birth control pills is just because women feel so much better with a little bit of estrogen than without it. And so on the one hand, I love access. I want access to contraception for all women who seek it, particularly in this like dystopian, post Roe era that we live in. I think it's super important that we make sure that every woman who wants to protect her body from pregnancy is able to do it. I worry about having this available over the counter just because a person can take it. Nobody knows that they're on it. And then if they fall into a major depression, it can really be catastrophic. So I worry about that. And so it's one of these things where I feel really ambivalent about it because it's like, on the one hand, like if there's a teenage girl or, whatever, who it's such a tough issue, it's like, but especially for adolescents, because when we look at the mental health risks associated with hormonal birth control use, um, by far the people who shoulder the burden of depression and anxiety and even suicidality, because there's been studies looking at the risk of suicide on whether you've been prescribed hormonal birth control or not, and it's overwhelmingly shouldered by these young girls, like girls who are 19 and younger. And so when you have these young women who are going on the pill because they think that they're doing something positive for their body, and they don't know that it can make them feel hopeless and that sort of thing, and nobody else knows that they're doing it, um, I really worry about that. And especially like the risk of suicide for these women it's 6 times higher. It's like 600%. So is another way to say it. It goes up 600% if you're on hormonal birth control compared to what you're not. And, with the high suicide risk that we have, I mean, because it's the rates have grown so high, and especially among girls, over the last 10 years. I really worry about that. And so, my answer to all of this, because, it's like, I think about this a lot because it's one of the, like, I think access is important. And I think that information is important. And letting people know that you're doing this is important. So the answer, I guess, for me is like, just make sure if you're somebody who does want to use it, is that please let somebody that you know that you're on it. So that way they can help monitor you. Because the thing that people don't realize about mental health and about side effects of drugs is that you don't experience it as, oh, I'm having this side effect. You usually experience it, and you don't experience it as, oh, I'm depressed. It's usually like, gosh, my life is terrible. I'm worthless. I'm not effective. I can't get things done. It's just like we just assume that our life has gotten worse. We don't think that it's because of the drug we're taking, and we don't think that it's because we have depression. We just think that we suck and that we're not able to cope. And so that's why it's so important to have somebody else who's able to observe you from the outside and who can say, like, you haven't been yourself. Like, is everything okay? And so I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's almost like, I know resources are so tight as is, but it would be nice if for those young girls, they had to have maybe a monthly check-in with a therapist or something if they were taking this. Because I understand also too that they're not always going to want to tell their parents that they're taking it, or they're not going to want to tell their family members, but maybe some outside party would help with that.
I love that
Yeah.
idea. Like, even like if it was on the package, for example, like if there was like a live video chat line that you can make an appointment with to talk about the effects or whatever, like I think that would be brilliant. And hopefully at least would get some girls willing to make those contacts to talk to somebody about what they're putting into their body and what the risks are. And so that way they know what to look out for. And that way they tell a close other to keep an eye out on them.
If someone's listening, Sarah, I'm pivoting a little bit and they're like, okay, I'm on birth control because I don't want to get pregnant. What would your recommendation be with other resources for them to use to prevent a pregnancy?
So in terms of like going on to something different, or what resources would I recommend?
I guess, yeah, something different. So if they're on birth control right now and they're like, okay, I'm hearing all this stuff, I don't want to be on it, but I also don't want to get pregnant. How do I manage not getting pregnant if I get
I know, I hate this question, and I get it all the time.
We get it all the time too.
Yeah, no, and the reason I hate it so much is because we don't have any good options. I think that they're all flawed, and so it's all about what trade-offs are you willing to make, right? And so my first response to that is educate yourself on the trade-offs that you make with hormonal birth control. Because once you understand what the range of effects that are possible are, some women will still land on birth control pills being the best thing for them, and so educate yourself on what it all means. What are all the trade-offs that you're making when you're on the pill? And they might work for you. And at different points in your life, they might make sense. And other points in your life, they might not make sense. So that would be the first thing I would recommend. The second thing is, there's the other options that are available to you is there's the non-hormonal IUD, which is the copper IUD. And this is something that, they don't actually understand how it prevents pregnancy because you still ovulate. So you're still producing hormones, which is why most women will feel psychologically normal because they're having their regular hormonal cycles. And they believe that it's the inflammatory response in the cervix that is essentially what's responsible for preventing pregnancy, because the uterus is like, we're not going to let anything implant because there's all this inflammation here. But it can be painful for women. It's like it's not a pleasant experience having that inserted or taken out, particularly if you haven't had children, because when you have children, it softens your cervix and makes it a little bit less painful, and it can cause painful cramping. And so there's other concerns with it, but that's one possibility. But if you don't mind a little bit of pain early on and the cramping, you're able to roll with it, because the cramping usually gets a lot less bad over time. But it's still not perfect. That's not that's not a bad option to try. Natural family planning, which it used to be called, and now it's called the fertility awareness method. But although the fertility awareness people would say, how dare you liken this to this? But it's very similar. It's essentially you're tracking your cycle, and you're measuring your basal body temperature and your cervical mucus, and essentially identifying the days in your cycle in which pregnancy is possible, and then either avoiding sex, having non-vaginal penile sex, or using condoms during that time, or a gel like Phexxi or something that can prevent pregnancy during times when you're in the fertile window. And this is, and this is what I use. Like I track my cycle, and this is what I use. So it works for me. But I'm also a partnered career woman. If I accidentally was pregnant, it wouldn't be the end of the world. If I was a teenager, I would absolutely never do this. And my cycles didn't really normalize until I was in my 20s. So it would not have been it would have been a very challenging method for me for much of my life. And so that one's great because it's all natural, right? And it does put you more in touch with your body. Like I recommend, even for women who aren't, keeping track of their cycle as a means of regulating their fertility, I definitely recommend it just for understanding yourself, because it's like I know I have so much more respect for my body. And now that I understand my cycle and like what's happening, and my partner tracks my cycle, and so he's like, "Oh, it's day 27. Like don't worry. You just say whatever crazy thing you want to."
My husband's like that too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. It's so funny. Yeah. He's like, he knows better than I do. And in fact, we had an argument the other day because I'm like, no, it's like day 26. He's like, no, Sarah, it's 27. You started 2 weeks Monday. Remember? He was right.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, it was really funny. I get pretty bad, like premenstrually, I'm kind of a bear. And so I think that he's very motivated to keep track of it so that way he can, sort of back slowly away. But so for the fertility awareness method is also another method that's available. Condoms, of course. There's the gel Phexxi, which some women don't experience positive reactions to, but others do. But it's the rate of failures, and I think I don't know, it's 90%, but it's not as good as the pill. And so it's another one where you have to kind of weigh what tolerance for risk you have given what's going on in your life. And I mean, that's about it. There's the diaphragm. Some people still use that. It requires a little bit of planning just because you have to pop it on there, and there's got to be spermicide and all these other things. But it's a barrier. It's another barrier method. It's not perfect, but it can help women prevent pregnancy. There just aren't a whole lot of really good options. And my hope is that we come up with digital birth control that works better. So something along the lines of what we see with something like natural cycles, where that's really effective and easy to use. I think is kind of a good direction to go in terms of what do I hope to see in the future? That's one thing I hope to see. I'm really excited about this gel that's being tested in men that doesn't seem to interfere with their hormones at all, but that interferes. It's called it essentially blocks the vas deferens, right? So it's like a vasectomy, but it's with some sort of a gel, and it's reversible. Like it just disintegrates over time. And if this works and it doesn't have any side effects, I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited about there was a trial that was done on non-human animals just last year, and they found that there's this weird derivative of vitamin A where it's and it doesn't seem to be used in anything else in the body except for sperm production. And what they found is that in mice, if you block the absorption of this particular derivative of vitamin A, that it prevents sperm production but doesn't seem to do anything else. So, which is really interesting. So as long as sperm production, because the thing is with women, when we prevent ovulation, that prevents us from making our hormones, because that's how we make our hormones. And so we need to learn more about what does sperm production do something else in the body besides just create sperm? But if it doesn't, and if we can prevent sperm production just by blocking something that the body doesn't seem to be using for anything else, I think it's brilliant. And that could also be another game changer. So I'm hoping that, between digital products for women and some of these types of products for men, that we might start to see some real innovation in this space. But it's really, it's pathetic.
Yeah, I remember a doctor recently saying that putting women on hormonal birth control makes their jobs easier and women's lives harder. And so I get it, because for doctors, they're like, I just want to help this person. Here's a pill. But you're right, there needs to be a lot more innovation in this space. And I think in your book, you also have, is it a chart or something? If people are interested in hormonal birth control, there's all kinds of different options, and you kind of break down what might be the better option for them. Is that right?
Yeah. So I've got two different charts. So one of them talks about the 4 different generations of progestins and sort of what are some of the major side effects associated with each type, because most women don't know that all of the different commercially available hormonal birth control, that they have there's a gazillion different kinds, and they use a handful of different types of progestins, and they tend to be very different from one another. So for example, if you're on something like the hormonal birth control shot, like Depo-Provera, for example, that's a first generation progestin, and it's kind of androgenic, so it stimulates testosterone receptors and it does a bunch of other things. Whereas if you're on a 4th generation progestin, which is what's in something like Yaz or Yasmin, that's actually anti-androgenic and it blocks testosterone receptors. And so, and then there's everything in between. So you've got the 2nd and 3rd gen. And so I talk about what are the different types of progestins that are in the pill, and then what are the sort of major categories of side effects that we see with each. And then I also provide a big chart with the 50 or 100 most frequently prescribed types of hormonal birth control. And then I provide information with the breakdown of the amount of synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone in each, what the progestin is that's in it, and what generation it is. And so that way women can use that. And if they're having a terrible time on, let's say they're taking, I don't know, something with a 3rd generation progestin and they feel terrible, that they can go to their doctor and say, okay, I know that I want to be on hormonal birth control, but this isn't working for me. Can we try something with a 2nd generation progestin? And then shooting that way. Because I think that a lot of the troubleshooting that needs to go on in terms of the pill has to do with how terrible the progestins make us feel. Because they're really the things that are responsible for a lot of the side effects. There's sort of 2 big players, 2 big movers and shakers in terms of bad side effects. Well, there's 3. One is the progestins stimulate receptors in the body that aren't progesterone receptors. And so they have all these weird effects, like stimulating glucocorticoid receptors or testosterone receptors. And does weird things in the body and makes us feel bad. Second thing is our bodies start to release a lot of sex hormone binding globulin. And this is something that grabs onto testosterone and makes it inactive. And so what we also see with women who are on the pill is that their testosterone levels are just absolutely in the toilet. And that doesn't make people feel good either. It saps motivation, it saps sexual desire. It makes us less interested in winning and competing. It just kind of like, it's a motivational killer. So that's another thing that goes on. And the third thing, of course, is that we're blocking ovulation. And when we do that, we're not synthesizing our own hormones. And so we're never in this like estrogen dominant state that is very positive for us to be in for those short periods of time across the cycle. Like estrogen dominance long term isn't like a good thing, but to have that little estrogen spike, the dynamic changes in estrogen and progesterone is something that's very healthy for us. And it's something that our brain and our body is adapted to because it's something that we've experienced throughout most of our human history until we interfered with the birth control.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk to you for hours. I'm like, I don't want to stop. You're a wealth of information.
People are going to get so much out of this. And also, what a great resource your book is, because I think sometimes we are all about telling people, sometimes you have to be your own advocate. And I feel like if you're on birth control, you want to get off, you're thinking about it, your daughter, whoever, I think this is such a good resource to have and say, I'm dealing with some of these symptoms. Maybe I can go to my doctor and talk about switching it up or getting off. So thank you for sharing all of this. I'm excited for your next book too, and whatever's coming ahead for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I think that it's really one thing that with the book that I think has been important and I think is great is that it does give women an experience like to look at what is possible in terms of the side effects. So that way they have had this suspicion that they're experiencing something, knowing that, okay, this could be my birth control. And then being able to, using the information in the book, being able to go to their doctor and say, here's what I'm on. I don't like it. Can we try this other one? And having a starting point for that, because a lot of doctors, especially GPs, like, you're just regular physician, which is where most women get their birth control from, have no idea even that there's different types of progestins. So for example, I was talking to somebody who's like a very well-known, a very well respected physician. He had no idea. He's like, I had no idea that there was 4 different generations. Because I mean, how could they? It's like when you're learning general medicine, I mean, they're not going to talk about what constitutes birth control and like what's in it and what are these different things, because they're studying the whole body. And so having that information, if you have a good, thoughtful physician and you present them with that information and say, here's what I'm on, this is a type of progestin, like, I think we maybe want to try something different. I'm thinking about this. Your doctor can then, look at all of their references and just make sure that they think it's safe for you. But most women that I've heard from who've gone to their doctor and talked to them have had a really positive experience because doctors want, I mean, for the most part, if you have a thoughtful doctor, they want to help. They just don't know what to do because there's no research. They're like, we want to help you, but we have nothing to give you except for the pill.
It's true. No, well, we're excited about this, and it's so great to hear that, people are seeing it different and, doctors are wanting to help. It's just important to be informed and understand the trade-offs. I wish I had this back in the day. So we're excited. We'll put all your information, Sarah, in our show notes so people can follow you, learn more about you, get your book. But you're amazing. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.